Jumble Plains is situated on the flat red soil plains of New South Wales, about 500 kilometres west of Sydney. The station or ranch is a prime location for raising livestock and growing wheat that swelters in the summer and freezes during the winter. Jumble Plains was purchased in 1927 by George McLellan, the son of a Scottish immigrant. During its heyday, the property was a lightning rod for some of the brightest minds and best events in the Tullamore area. It was the site of an annual golf tournament, horse races, ballroom dances, school concerts and fireworks displays in the region. Previously, it had been a changing station for the legendary Cobb & Co coaches that were one of the mainstays of transportation in the bush.
Well, this is a very famous property and an enormous house and the centre of a lot of community events. Right here is the ballroom. Not many houses come with a ballroom, but this is a giant ballroom with a parquetry flooring, and we had lots and lots of events, school functions and ballroom dancing, piano in the corner, and I remember that with great fondness. That's where I learnt to dance. So that was a big part of my growing up, and it pains me that the place has now had it and it's not doing what it was doing before.
But there was more to Jumble Plains than an eclectic mix of bush glamour and good old-fashioned ranching. The McLellan family were at the heart of the entire operation, and they were stalwart leaders in the area. The family weathered the same trials that any other grazing family in the Australian bush might endure, including a 7-year drought, being overrun by rabbits, and having to deal with below-average crops. In 1940, George McLellan's grandson was born. His parents couldn't decide on a name for their firstborn child, and according to family law, they decided on his name on the way to the hospital. They named him A.Anthony McLellan, and he came to be known as Tony. Tony, what was your first memory of this house?
Big, rambling, famous, and I remember rolling on the lawn with my dad when I was probably 3 or maybe 4. That's what sort of sticks in my mind, probably brought back by a picture of the photograph.
Tony McLellan grew up at Jumble Plains. He worked the land alongside his father, shooting rabbits, filling bags of wheat, shearing sheep and droving cattle. But he didn't stay confined to the Australian bush. Carrying the stock whip he had been given as a boy as a reminder of his roots, Tony McLellan travelled the world. Tony, what's that you've got in your hand?
Well, this is my beautiful whip that I've had for 70 years. My dad gave me this and taught me how to crack it, and obviously used a lot with cattle rather than sheep. And then when I became a stock and station agent, I used it excessively. I got so attached to it that I took it with me around the world. It's been in 8 countries with me, and I'm never going to let it go.
From Singapore and Hong Kong to Egypt, to London, Canada, the United States, to New Zealand, and finally back to Australia. This son of the bush climbed to the pinnacle of corporate success. He became a thriving real estate mogul and a mining entrepreneur. His story is one of both immense success and crushing defeat, a narrative that weaves together moments of wrenching despair and glorious triumph, a tale of hard work coupled with a deep spiritual awakening. Join me this week as we look at the action-packed life of Tony McLellan, shearer, drover, wildly successful businessman, humanitarian, man of God, and a true blue Australian through and through.
I would describe Tony McLellan as a highly intelligent and thoughtful man, a kindly man, a man of enormous generosity of spirit, and someone who seems to have almost wired into his DNA a desire to make a contribution and to serve. I don't think he has such a thing as a philosophy of retirement.
The first word that comes to mind when I'm describing Tony is persistent. Like he came to me and he said, "Please, can you help me write my book?" And I said, "I'd love to, Tony, but I'm far too busy. I've got a full-time job and 50 other things going on." But he wouldn't give up. And in the end, I said yes. and I think that's what made him successful in life, just persistence, sticking at it. The same thing that got me to write his book was the thing that made him very successful in life, and a very lovable man as well.
A motivated dynamo. I would call Tony McLellan a motivated dynamo. He's motivated by his very deep Christian faith. He's also motivated by the free enterprise desire to experiment, to succeed where appropriate lead. And he has boundless energy. And I also credit him with a very good business brain. So that's a pretty formidable combination.
Well, I think like anybody who really excels in a particular profession or discipline, that Tony has an intuition, particularly for business, but more than that, he's got a real heart for people. And I've seen him on many occasions, for instance, travel, despite the fact of his own health at the time not being good, travel hundreds of kilometres in order to comfort a friend or encourage a friend. And I suppose, above everything, for those who know him, he's an encourager of everybody he meets.
Tony McLellan is a wonderful, gracious man, full of wisdom. There's an aura about him that tells you that he's full of life's experiences, but there's also something different about him, and I think that's the Christian element in his life, which provides somebody who's led an amazing business life, but yet has a calmness about him that is not often seen in people that have been as successful as he has been in his business life.
I'd describe Tony as, in my experience, something unique. We did go to the same school, but not at the same time, I have to say. His personal story is simply extraordinary. But in personal terms, I've always found him to be deeply caring of the person he's talking to. Now, that's, I won't say unique, but it is unusual. And also ready to encourage.
Tony's a bit of a force of nature, really. He's one of those people who comes in, radiates confidence, encouragement, and the desire to help, and picks people up, picks organisations up, picks things up, and helps to bring them to a better place. So, look, Tony has had a significant role in business over the years. He's made a lot of money, he's lost a lot of money, he's made a lot of money again, and now he's determined to use the resources he's got for good, and I think that's wholly admirable.
Tony McLellan was born at the Tullamore Hospital near Jumble Plains on the 1st of April 1940, in the middle of one of the most tenuous times in history. When he entered the world, Australia was in the early stages of the Second World War, and times were tough for the working class. He was also born in the midst of one of the worst droughts of the century. But as is almost always the case in this rugged but resilient land, the drought broke and the farmers managed to hold on to their lands and their sheep and cattle. Perhaps it was growing up in conditions like this that shaped Tony into the indomitable and resilient man that he later became. Tony, what was life like growing up in the outback here at Jumble Plains?
Oh, it was so amazing just to think that I was blessed with this incredible opportunity to live on this giant property and learn something about farming, raising cattle, and it swells into me now when I think about it all.
As a boy and youth, Tony's days were filled with typical rounds of farm chores. At the time, Australian landholders were being overrun by rabbits, and he spent much of his time bagging rabbits so they could be slaughtered and sent off to an abattoir. But his responsibilities grew as he did, and he soon found himself shearing sheep and spending hours on horseback in the open country and working as a stockman and station agent and auctioneer.
The farming, it was mainly sheep, but also cattle, and but we grew wheat and we grew oats, feed for the sheep principally, and so farmed about 1,000 acres a year in that way. But I'm mainly been a stock person.
So Tony, what's involved in being a stockman?
Well, being a stockman is more complex than most city folk would understand. They somehow think that you just walk behind the sheep and the sheep find their own way. But training your dogs, training your horses, and learning how to control them and manage them, there's lots of activities with the sheep that you have to plan for. And I didn't really appreciate that until my dad died and I took over. And because I got up in the morning and he said, "Okay, Tony, we're going to do this." But when he was gone, I had to figure out what it is we're going to do. As a lot of planning goes on. And we've had up to 1,000 head of cattle here. That takes a lot of managing too, and a lot of horses and so on. So more to it than meets the eye.
Of course, growing up on a station that also handled cattle and sheep provided its share of misadventures and near misses. Like the time he was engaged in delousing sheep by spraying them with arsenic.
We got up really early one morning to dip the sheep. We'd just installed a new shower instead of a down a long trough, and that involved a tank reservoir of arsenic, which we then pumped up and sprayed over the sheep. It was the known way in those days to treat lice and eliminate them from the sheep wool. Unfortunately, it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Maybe I wasn't bright and white as I should have been, and I slipped and fell into the dip. And on the way down, scraped my thigh and my leg on the side of this rough concrete and ended up plunging into the arsenic. They pulled me out, hosed me down, and then rushed me off to hospital to try to get the last of the arsenic off, and treated it with iodine, which, if you've had iodine on a little sore, it stings. When you have a whole leg done, it stings a lot. But eventually came back home, spent a couple of days recovering, and got back and stuck into the dip.
While the station provided Tony with numerous adventures, he also experienced his fair share of excitement at school. He was first sent to the Pinefield Public School, where there was only a maximum of 11 students across 5 grades, all crammed together in a single-roomed hut. The experience was both fun and confining.
Fortunately, a group of graziers in the district collaborated and got a little hut and renovated it, built bicycle sheds, built toilets, pit toilets for the boys and girls, and started a school 3 miles away And I had to ride there every day to this tiny little school that had 11 kids. And I spent 5 years there. No one ever in my grade. So when I came out on 6th grade, I was ducks.
Ducks every year.
Ducks every year.
And what was it like in a small school like that?
Well, I didn't have anything with which to compare it, except that at the end, my parents said, well, you've got to go to high school. And they packed me off to Scots College in Sydney. And I went into a boarding school with 1,000 boys. It was daunting. I've never mixed with more than a couple of boys. And the place was swarming with them. In my first dormitory, there were 11 boys in my bedroom. Very, very off-putting.
Among the pleasant surprises Tony encountered at Scots was his discovery of the game of cricket. He saw his first cricket match there. This was largely due to the fact that he had never been in a place where 11 boys could be rustled up to form one team, let alone 22 boys to form two teams.
Well, I was introduced to cricket. I'd never seen cricket out here, and I was introduced to rugby. I'd played tennis out here, so we had our own tennis courts here, Jumble Plains, but I was taught cricket, taught rugby, and because I was a bit bigger than my average size for my age, I got into the A team and liked that a lot, but had no idea of the techniques, but eventually picked it up and we went on to become the champions.
Tony's time at boarding school was marred by the illness of his father, Alan. In July 1956, Tony received word that his father was very ill.
At 15, in fact, my dad became very ill and asked me when I was home at September holidays whether I'd be prepared to leave school and come and help him run the property. And I jumped at the idea. It wasn't that I didn't like school, but I didn't enjoy it, but I did enjoy working here. And I left school, and a few months later he died on his 44th birthday. Very tragic.
His father's death was a difficult blow for the 16-year-old Tony to deal with, but he resolved to honour his father by becoming the best man he could be, taking as his motto these words from Tennyson's poem Ulysses: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. His father's death also provided a sudden introduction to the responsibilities of adulthood. Barely 16, Tony was left to manage Jumble Plains and its team of adult workers on his own. The following 3 years proved to be a tough apprenticeship with a steep learning curve. Tony was forced to quickly master all the skills needed to manage cattle, sheep and farming.
Well, it meant that I gave up all studies and I took control of this property. My mother and my two sisters moved to Sydney, and I was living on this property on my own. I was cooking and sewing and cleaning and running the property. We had a team of men, obviously, but I was the boss. It was a big awakening. And as I'd said before, one thing, learning the skills, learning how to fence, for example, but it's another thing, planning. And I didn't have any idea because every morning my dad was here, he said, "Okay, Tony, we're going to go and do this today." And I said, "Oh, let's go." I didn't have any idea of the importance or the relevance of that.
Sadly, regardless of a relentless drive to persevere, even in the face of some terrible setbacks, after 3 years of working the land, Tony was forced to sell Jumble Plains. Regardless of how well the wool market was doing, the estate taxes following his father's death dealt the property a crippling blow.
Well, in those days, when my dad died in 1956, we had death duties, both federal and state, and they were enormous and monstrous and caused most people to sell the property, to break it up, to be able to pay the death duties. So that we set about doing that and broke the property up into smaller parcels and sold it bit by bit to generate the cash to pay the death duties. So you get down to a much smaller property, and then the house started to age, and we got damaged in '56 by floods. We were flood-bound for 8 months, and it became tough going.
After selling the property, Tony became a stock and station agent and auctioneer, starting off with the Australian Mercantile Land and Finance Company in Sydney. He was sent to Young, which was then a large livestock sales centre, to learn the art of auctioneering. It was when staying in the Tottenham Hotel that Tony first met his wife Ray. It was a Monday morning in October 1959, and Tony went to his usual breakfast spot only to find a young lady seated at what he had come to think of as his own table. The young lady was chatting with a friend of Tony's who usually joined him for breakfast.
I came down to breakfast the first morning I was in the hotel, and I sat down at the table with a young man who was a bank teller at the time, and said good morning, and then looked up and another young man was coming in through the door, and said good morning and concentrated on eating my breakfast, and got up very soon after and left.
This is absolutely the moment my life was redefined. I didn't know at the time, but it's led to 61 years of wonderful marriage, 3 beautiful kids, and experiences all around the world began at this very table. I remember being quite shy, and I don't think, I'm sure, we didn't know one another by name.
No.
And when Ray left, I asked the other fellow, who was that? And he told me she was the new school teacher in town. And I thought, she's pretty good looking. And shortly thereafter, I went upstairs to the lounge to play the piano, and she came by.
And he was playing a favourite tune of mine, and I commented on it, and we started to chat, and he invited me to go to some friends' place, and I thought for a moment, and I thought my grandmother will kill me if I say yes. And I said okay. And so we went and met some lovely people, and we started to talk to one another quite freely and happily at that stage. And so the next time I met him in the morning at breakfast again was much easier and much more friendly.
10 months later, they were engaged. And 5 months after that, they were married on the 19th of January, 1961 in Sydney. They bought their first home, a tiny weatherboard and fibro cement home in Warren, Western New South Wales, and settled into a life as a newly married couple. The first 2 years of their marriage were fraught with challenges and a lot of change. They moved to Sydney where, among other opportunities, Tony saw an opening to resume his education, which he had abandoned in the wake of his father's death. They lived in Ashfield, where Ray began teaching, and Tony simultaneously took up 2 courses in property valuation. While studying, he managed to land a job in the property department of a big corporation in North Sydney. Tony finished his studies, winning all the prizes with the highest grade since 1929. He was then elected the youngest director ever to the board of the Commonwealth Institute of Valuers. Their first son, Scott, was born in February 1966, and their second son, Stuart, was born 2 years later. Then came their daughter Samantha in 1972. The McLellans found themselves living the great Australian dream. A boy from the bush and the red dirt plains of the outback, making it big in Sydney with a happy and healthy family. No one could have asked for more. And yet, God had so much more in store for all of them. In September 1967, Tony and Ray decided to uproot their family at the request of Tony's new employer, who had invited him to open the firm's office in Melbourne. It is at this point that his career in real estate really began to take off. While the new career opportunities that came his way were lucrative, they required long working hours. Reflecting on this later in life, Tony admits that his workload took a toll on both his family life and his spiritual life. During much of his early career, Tony managed a slew of high-profile real estate development projects that had him working for big corporations both at home and around the globe. In the 1970s, he was given the opportunity of managing a massive real estate development project in Egypt. It was a challenge, but one that Tony and Ray tackled with a blend of pragmatism and determination. They packed up the family and moved to Egypt, where Tony took up the reins of the new project and settled into managing one of the biggest business challenges of his entire career at the age of just 35. It was a grand adventure that saw him learning Arabic and navigating the intricacies of doing business throughout the Middle East. During their time in Egypt, the McLellans hosted lavish parties for members of the Saudi royal family, attended glitzy dinner parties at embassies, survived a populist riot, and explored the wonders of the famous Valley of the Kings.
It was a very incredible experience. It was a very steep learning curve for me because I came from quite humble background and never thought I would ever be travelling like that or doing what I was doing. But we had a very active sort of playing tennis, horse riding. I loved horse riding in Egypt. I did that every day, riding around the pyramids and the Sphinx. It was incredible.
But the McLellans' time in Egypt was marred by the nationalisation of the project that Tony was working on. Reflecting on it later in his autobiography, Tony wrote, "We must constantly remind ourselves that the hardships of life are not sent by an unkind destiny to crush us, but to challenge us. We must persevere."
I litigated against the government of Egypt for 13 3/4 years, spending $5 million in legal fees, and finally won. And I could have given up 25 times, and maybe should have given up 25 times, but I determined to stick it out and keep fighting. And we won a major, major victory, which is in all the legal books of the world now. And so I'd say that is amongst the great things that I could put my hand over the heart and say I'm very proud of that.
While working on the project in Egypt, he received another offer. This one was to move to Canada to undertake another real estate development project. The family moved to Toronto in August 1979. After a few months in Canada, Tony was given another opportunity, this time to move out of hotel development, which he had been largely involved in, and into resource mining. It was a big shift, mostly because, by his own admission, he knew nothing about resources or mining. But Tony McLellan has never been a man to back down from a challenge. Accepting the offer, he formed a new corporation, negotiated shareholders' agreements, found investors, and travelled to Denver, Colorado for a crash course in geology and the extraction of oil and gas. In many ways, The McLellans were high flyers, jetting around the world in plush aircraft, rubbing shoulders with the movers and shakers of the world, from billionaire oil tycoons to famous rock stars.
I travelled extensively in the Middle East and met them, and the most famous of all is Adnan Khashoggi, who was mixed with, like I'm mixing with you. It's very open, friendly, warm relationship. Visit them in all their homes around the world. Travelled on their private jet planes all over the place.
Visited to their yachts, their massive yachts, and
It's a monster. So we've been on that many times, and anyway, lots of that jetting about.
In 1982, the McLellans moved once more, this time to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to take over the operations of an oil company. 2 years later, they took a family vacation to Beaver Springs, Arkansas. While the McLellans were in Arkansas, a tornado struck Tulsa, causing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. The McLellans came home to find their neighbourhood devastated and their apartment in shambles. But with his signature indomitable spirit, Tony pushed through the disaster. Salvaging what they could from their storm-damaged home, they hightailed it to Houston, Texas, where they had been scheduled to move in a few months. By 1987, Tony had moved the family yet again, this time to Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta at the time was very much like Sydney, with its constant bustle and burgeoning population. In Atlanta, Tony landed yet another high-profile property development job. The years continued to fly by in a blur of successful deals, lavish parties, and watching their children grow up. Everything seemed to be going well until Tony hit what he calls a midlife crisis around his 47th birthday.
I didn't like that aspect of it because I was pretty much in charge of the children, and I wanted to have his input, and he would get angry sometimes because he was overworked, worked longer hours, and it was very hard for me to accept the fact that that was part of the job, and that he was overworked, stressed.
And I also travelled a lot.
Yes.
I had
Huge amount.
I remember looking back on 1 year, and I had 35% of my nights in a foreign country. So I'd take off. This mainly when we started heavily in London and then in Toronto, and I was travelling all around the world. And so I was away a lot, and when you get back, you're jet-lagged and tired and got lots of business deals cooking. And so was hard, and I didn't realise how much damage it was doing to Ray and the family.
After years of pouring his energy into his career, cracks began to appear in his marriage. Around this time, a friend introduced him to Dr. Michael Youssef, an Egyptian minister who had lived in Australia for many years. At the time, the McLellans were not regular churchgoers. They attended occasionally and would have considered themselves to be Christians. But by Tony's own admission, church attendance didn't fall into the top tier of his priorities. Dr. Youssef invited the McLellans to attend his church, and finally, after repeated invitations, they attended a service on Christmas Eve. But while the family loved the experience, it wasn't really a turning point. What did prove to be a turning point was a crisis in their marriage. Over the Christmas and New Year period of that same year, the McLellans' marriage began to deteriorate. Tony describes himself as becoming verbally abusive towards his wife and their children. While Ray patiently bore the situation for a time, there came a point when she chose to remove herself from what had become a toxic situation.
Yes, we had a rather foul argument between Christmas and New Year, and I said to Tony, enough's enough, I can't do this anymore. And he said, well, I'll just leave you and let you stew over this for a few days. And what he didn't realise was that I believe strongly that God's hand was in it. I had, for once, the only time in my life, a bunch of cash, because I had never before cashed my housekeeping allowance, and I did, and had cash in my hand. And so I was able to go and stay in a hotel for a couple of days and sort of get my thoughts together. And I thought, I have to go to Australia. I just can't stay here. We have to bring this to a head. I had no intention of getting a divorce. I didn't want a divorce, but I wanted to think about it and think things through and see whether there was any way forward for me. For a good number of months, maybe even a few years, I'd thought things were very wrong. There was something not right. And so I got plane tickets for Samantha and me, and we left and went to Australia. And Tony came back from playing tennis, which he'd gone for a few days to do, and found that I'd gone. And I think gave him a very nasty, unpleasant shock.
Tony was shattered. Reflecting on the incident, he writes, "I cannot recall a moment in my life of such despair, and seldom have I felt so broken." He felt as though everything he had worked so hard for the last 30 years was now out the window, and he faced a gaping hole of futility. With his wife gone, he struggled to see purpose and meaning in his life. Overwhelmed by utter despair, Tony collapsed in a heap in front of his expensive but empty home. It was a moment of absolute despondency, and he realised that he needed help, but he didn't know where to turn.
It was, for a get-up-and-go driven businessman, it was an absolute heartbreak and humiliating. And I remember our two boys were there. They were home from college, university, and I just lay on the floor and sobbed. I didn't know what was going to happen next. And they were very supportive, not of particularly of me, I don't think, but trying to encourage me to pluck myself up and get going.
He called his wife in a desperate attempt to convince her to come home, but she refused to speak to him for a week. When he had hit rock bottom, his minister friend Dr. Youssef called and told him that he would like to come by for a visit. When Dr. Youssef arrived, he took one look at Tony and knew that he wasn't doing well.
When I explained what was happening, he said, "You need Jesus." And I said, "No, I need help." I didn't, at that time, wasn't aware, wasn't conscious of the fact that the source of the help was Jesus. But he's so good with business people. And he got me on my knees praying, and my whole life changed from that very moment. And the most amazing thing is that within 10 minutes, I realised I was the cause of the problem. I would have never admitted. I always thought it was Ray was difficulty. Well, why wasn't she more sympathetic with my travelling and so on? And suddenly I realised it was mine.
Tony experienced the healing power of the words of Psalm 23 and verse 1. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He realised that God is a shepherd who is willing to search for and recover his lost sheep who have gone astray.
His whole demeanour had changed. It was quite extraordinary to me that his entire character seemed to have changed. He was softer. He was more caring. He was more interested in me as a person rather than just the wife who did everything. And it was funny because when Michael Youssef, our minister, called me in Australia, he said, "Tony's changed." I said, "Oh, Michael, I've heard that before." And he said, "No, seriously, he has." I said, "Well, I'll believe it when I see it." And I could believe it. And one of the things Michael said to me was, "Ray, you should have done this 10 years ago. He needed this." And I had no idea that I was causing such an upheaval when I did what I did. I just had to get away. That was what my thought was. I have to get away. And it was amazing. And it wasn't easy because, we'd take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that happened for quite a few months. And I think through prayer and through our shared faith, it made an enormous difference.
In January of 1988, Tony arrived in Australia and was reunited with his wife. They were reconciled and flew back to their home in Atlanta to start afresh. After they had settled in, they decided to serve God through the agency of Christian Ministries. Not long after his reconciliation with Ray, Tony ventured into software development. At the time, the IT industry was still in its infancy, and the potential inherent in the new advancements excited Tony. He raised capital and set up the McLellan Software Centre, signing a deal with a team of Brazilian software developers in January 1991. But the venture proved to be difficult to navigate. The company ran out of money and took with it much of Tony's finances. His life savings disappeared. The banks foreclosed on their lavish home, and they were forced to sell their cars in order to raise cash to survive. Their financial situation became so bad that there were times when they had less than $20 between them. At times they were so overwhelmed by their difficulties that they found it hard to pray. Their minister gave them some sound advice. He told them to spend their prayer time praising and thanking God for everything they did have. And this piece of wisdom proved to be a great source of comfort and help. For 2 years, the McLellans lived on the gifts and support of their friends, plus tiny amounts of investment capital Tony was able to raise. One day they returned home to find a friend had left a $100 bill with a small note, which simply said, "We love you." Another time, Tony and Ray were seriously worried about how they would be able to put food on the table when a friend from their Bible study group gave them a gift of $550 that saw them through. Through the 4 years of financial hardship that the McLellans endured, they were often tempted to despair over their circumstances, but God sustained them. Their faith in God, the support of their church community, gave them strength to weather the storm. Finally, after years of struggling, Tony got his first break when a Dutch investor was willing to give him the seed capital he needed to start a new software company. When he eventually returned to Australia, they set up the McLellan Foundation and a number of ministries for which they provided seed capital. Tony went a step further and kicked off a new career in the Christian not-for-profit world, co-founding Citizens for Community Values. He served on the board of Opportunity International and was appointed chairman of Habitat for Humanity and later the Australian Christian Lobby.
Well, Tony came into the lobby when we'd been going for about 5 years, I suppose, and he joined the board, which I was very appreciative of. He then became the chairman of the board, and he held that position for over 10 years. So through that leadership on the board and through his general interaction with people in this encouraging style that he has, it's been a very, very significant impact on the lobby and its development.
And he provided enthusiasm, and he reminded people that those who are successful in business include people who are willing to devote their physical and financial resources to separate and often noble pursuits.
Tony was involved in the governance from its early years, and also in being a generous donor in helping it get established from very, very small beginnings.
The Australian Christian lobby has had a massive impact on public life in Australia, and that's thanks to the work of people like Tony and Jim Wallace, who had the vision for it and got it established. You know, the idea that Christians should actually have a part to play in public life, should actually hear their voice heard, should actually be able to talk about the values and principles that come from the gospel in the context of public life, has been very important at a time when I think there are many in the progressive side of politics that would like to push Christians right out of the public square. I think that refusal to be silenced and the importance of speaking up for the principles, for God's will, is tremendously important. And without Tony's persistence and the vision of Jim Wallace, I think there would be a big hole in Australian public life that wouldn't have been filled.
After 10 years at the Australian Christian Lobby, he stepped down as chairman and was given the honorary title of Chairman Emeritus. Years later, Tony formed the Chrysos Corporation in partnership with CSIRO. This company has developed photon assay, a new technology that has significantly improved the mining value chain. The success of the venture has enabled the McLellan Foundation to invest in Christian projects around the world. Tony wanted to turn his success into lasting significance. He wanted to make a difference. This is especially seen in two of the projects most dear to Tony's heart. The first is the building of the McLellan Hall, a new facility at the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, of which Tony has been a director for many years. The next is the Phaedra Hospital near the capital of Tanzania. Funded by the McLellan Foundation, the Phaedra is a fistula hospital dedicated to serving the needs of women in East Africa. Fistula is an injury that occurs during childbirth and, if left untreated, can result in lifelong consequences, which can significantly diminish a woman's quality of life. The Phaedra Hospital was named for and dedicated to the memory of Phaedra Vrontometis, who was Tony and Ray's daughter Samantha's mother-in-law. On a warm August morning in 1998, the United States Embassy in Nairobi was targeted by Al-Qaeda. Phaedra Vrontometis was among the many who died that day. She had worked for the US Embassy for 33 years, and in the space of a heartbeat, she was gone. For Tony, these projects represent a move from success to significance, a shift in direction from simply amassing wealth and living an affluent lifestyle to a life that impacts individuals and communities in meaningful and life-changing ways. Reflecting on the importance of the idea of giving back, the famous children's author A.A. Milne wrote these words: "In the quiet hours, when we are alone and there is nobody to tell us what fine fellows we are, we come sometimes upon a moment in which we wonder not how much money we are earning, nor how famous we have become, but what good we are doing." Despite the huge achievements of this boy from the bush, as Tony reflects back on his life, it's times of trial and loss that he comments on. In his book, Tony outlines 3 important lessons that we can all learn and apply to our lives in challenging times. Firstly, we must accept God's discipline and yield to His correction. God uses trials to help us grow and achieve success. Having this perspective can give us courage to face our trials. Second, we must keep our eyes fixed on the only one who can deliver us from our trials, Jesus Christ. And finally, we must persevere in faith and hope and courage, fully believing that when we have done the will of God, we will receive what He has promised. Tony's encounter with Jesus Christ in his moment of brokenness not only shaped the way he dealt with life's trials, both personal and business, it also changed his whole value system, what was important to him. When the young, aggressive Tony made money, he lived a lavish lifestyle that looked wonderful to others. But underneath, his life was falling apart. He flew around the world in the Concorde and vacationed on private yachts. But when Tony was changed by God's power in his life, he made money and gave it away to help others.
Tony's conversion to Christian faith gave him a great impetus to be a very good businessman who could be trusted and could be seen to be trusted. And it also gave him a surprising drive to succeed in business so that he could use the proceeds to make a difference in other people's lives. And Tony seems extraordinarily motivated in a very admirable way to want to make a contribution to others for as long as he can.
Tony's Christian faith causes him to look outwards. I think where a lot of people look inwards. What can this do for me? What can it do for my company? What can it do for my family? Tony is always thinking, what can this do for humanity, for my fellow human beings, for God's creatures? And I think that way of looking at the world just changes the way you do business and changes the way you think about wealth and the importance of wealth and possessions. Everything in Tony's life is about how can I best use this for God's glory, not for my own.
The man's impact and influence is quite extraordinary, both at a public policy level but at a deeply practical level in helping those in desperate need wherever they are around the globe.
When I was a Member of Parliament, I used to say that there were lots of people who wanted to give me their advice. There were a smaller number of people who were prepared to give me their time, but there was almost no one who was prepared to hand over their cash. And yet, to get anything done, you need resources, and the foundational resource of everything is cash. So Tony McLellan is one of those people who is prepared to come with that which counts, with cold, hard cash to help the causes, the individuals he believes in. And that makes him incredibly significant, particularly on the centre-right, if you like, on the conservative side of our public and community life, because these are difficult times for people who believe in what might be described as traditional values, traditional institutions, traditional ways of life. And Tony is one of those people who doesn't just lament the difficulties that we have, he tries in his own way to do something to make them better. So that's wonderful. Long may it continue.
The story of Tony McLellan's life is one of perseverance, determination, and the joy of walking with Jesus. These are the lessons Tony teaches us. The value of good old-fashioned hard work and the necessity of faith to bring us through the hard times. But perhaps the most poignant part of Tony's story is the truth that God is always striving to reach us, no matter how young or old we are or where we are in life. It is never too late to give your life to Jesus. There is no problem too big, no sin too dark, no struggle too fierce that Jesus doesn't have a remedy for. He sees you and He knows you, and He's reaching out to you in love and compassion. If you would like to make the choice to follow Jesus today, then I'd like to recommend the free gift we have for all our Incredible Journey viewers today. It's the booklet, Tips for a Successful Life. This booklet is our gift to you and is absolutely free. I guarantee there are no costs or obligations whatsoever. So make the most of this wonderful opportunity to receive your free gift today.
Phone or text 0436 333 555 in Australia or 020 422 2042 in New Zealand or 770 800 0266 in the United States. Or visit our website tij.tv or simply scan the QR code on your screen and we'll send you today's free offer totally free of charge and with no obligation. You can also write to us at the addresses on your screen or email us at info@tij.tv. Don't delay. Call or text us now.
If you've enjoyed our journey with Tony McLellan from Jumble Plains to the pinnacle of international success and our reflections on turning our successes into lasting significance, then be sure to join us again next week when we will share another of life's journeys together. Until then, let's pray to the great God of the universe who loves us, cares for us, and guides us. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the way that you have guided and led Tony McLellan. We pray that you will guide our lives also. Please lead us and our families from here to eternity. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.